Hey everybody, Hoosier Jedi here with another review for you. This time I'm talking about episode 9 of season 3 of The Walking Dead called The Suicide King. I've got some genuinely mixed feelings about this episode. It's not a bad episode by any measure, but let me put it this way. There is no real central character in this episode. Now, this is not an unreasonable choice on the part of the writers. We're coming back after a decent hiatus, so it makes perfect sense that they'd want to take some time to let us, emotionally check in with everybody. And everybody does have, well, a line at the very least. Well, okay, Michan mostly just kind of gets to glare a little bit. That's about all for her, but you get what I'm saying here. So, it does do its job in showing us where mentally everybody is. But because of that, because it has to touch on everybody, and there are a lot of characters floating around, nobody gets a whole lot of focus. So this just it does feel like an unfocused episode in that regard. But let's get right into it. But before we dive into the characters and whatnot, first of all, I really don't quite get the title of this episode. Nobody commits suicide, and you say the Suicide King to me. I think what that. Wait, are you talking about that Christopher Walken movie, The Suicide Kings? I mean, if this is a reference to something else that I'm just not getting, somebody please tell me. But yeah, the title of this episode does not make sense to me. Anyway, the first thing that, and this is I think one of the major flaws of this episode, is let's start talking about Merle and Daryl, since this is where we pick up. Is what in the world was Merle's plan exactly? I mean, he really didn't have any way to know that Rick's group was getting ready to bust in there, gun down a teenage girl by, I'm assuming, accident. That was Haley, the wall guard in training, who kind of got on Andrea's case in case you missed that. And yeah, so I mean, really, what in the world was Merle planning? It just doesn't make any sense. Now, apart from that, there's really not a lot going on with Merle. We get to see him, being a racist asshole once he and the group are to safety. Him saying all kinds of BS to Chon, and just being Merle. So no doubt it was quite satisfying for many other viewers, including myself, to see Rick just to give him a good whack to the head to shut him up. And that kind of leads us to our big thing: is the big conflict going on with the Dixon brothers is, of course, whether or not Daryl's conflicting desire to stay with the group, who have become a true family to him, or to go off with his brother, who, as Daryl says, is his blood. He's the only blood he's got left in the world. And of course, Rick is taking the perfectly reasonable stance that no way are we letting Merle in the prison. I mean, Merle's like throwing a match at a pile full of dynamite. If really, if they brought him there, yeah, all hell would most certainly break loose. So, even though it is driving Daryl away, Rick is, in my book, making the right decision. And I like how it is actually Carol who really kind of illustrates an interesting point here when she's talking with Beth, and she's talking about how, the woman I was a year ago, and I'd like to think that if Ed were to walk through that door alive and well, that I'd tell him to go to hell. Well, Carol, I'll give you some serious points. You're a lot better than your comic book counterpart, and if that were to happen, I'm pretty sure that now you would be able to do that. But drawing the parallel between Ed and Merle and their abusive personalities is actually an extremely insightful moment there. We have really seen that in the past, that Merle really did tend to dominate Daryl. He obviously mistreated him a lot when they were growing up. But again, in this world, Merle is really the only blood family that Daryl has left. And now I'm thinking about this. I have relatives who I don't particularly care for. But if the world were to come to an end, or go to hell, or whatever, even then, and if I had the if I would really still be very reluctant to just leave them to their own fates. no matter how much I might dislike them. Even if I had some kind of an option of, safety and emotional stability with some other people, and for whatever reason I couldn't bring that person into that group, still it would not be an easy choice for me to just abandon them because, well, family is family. Now, exactly how well this choice that he's made is going to work out for Daryl, well, that's going to be interesting to see. Carol is not the only one who's not the person that she was a year ago. Daryl is a guy who has really stepped up. If something were to have happened to Rick, I don't think anybody would have been terribly surprised if it had been Daryl who stepped in and took control as leader of the group. So, he's not the same guy that Merle knew. And you can tell that Merle is basically just going to start right back in on the old act. But something tells me that's not going to fly so well with the new Daryl. Now, let's see. We've already talked about Carol. Like I said, I think she's really grown well as a character. She's certainly much better than her counterpart in the comics. And that scene that she had with Beth was quite nice. Not a whole lot going on with Beth this time around, but she's still, again, certainly a much more interesting character than she was in season 2. We've seen her sort of falling into a role of responsibility. She's seems to be the primary caregiver for Judith, and don't forget, we did see her kick a little bit of zombie butt early in the season. So, I think Beth is somebody we should not underestimate. And of course, the fact that Carl seems to have a little bit of a crush on her. There's still some storytelling potential there, I think. Nothing really to say about Axel this time around. He really only gets like one line, maybe two. As I've said, Michonne, I don't think she said even a single word. Well, no, I take that back. I'm pretty sure she did actually say one or two things. But seriously, what is up with Michonne that she cannot answer the simplest question? Like, do you know Andrea? Well, just given by what she has to have overheard with the group, I mean, she knows that Glenn and Maggie knows what's going on with Glenn and Maggie. I mean, really, there is absolutely nothing for her to lose by confirming this, but she simply will not. And while she has very good reasons to be defensive around new people, this is taking defensive into the realm of just being stupid. Which is a real shame because Michonne is one of the coolest characters in the Walking Dead comics, and she's just so far hasn't quite been getting the justice I'd been hoped for. And speaking of characters who are awesome in the comics but not so awesome on the show, let's talk Andrea. Folks, Andrea is my favorite character in the Walking Dead comics. I'll be up front with you right there. I do not know what to do with TV Andrea. I mean, it is potentially interesting to see her going from basically bouncing around in the governor's bed to being a potential conflict with him, even emerging as a potential rival for leadership in Woodbury. I mean, that's certainly on paper an interesting idea if that's where things are going. But let's see, Andrea's real way of dealing with the situation in Woodbury is trite sayings. And the idea of going on about, when they write this and blah, blah, blah in the history books. Look, Andrea, in case you haven't noticed, you're living in the freaking zombie apocalypse. I somehow think that the days of the book publishing industry are over. I mean, I cannot believe that the people of Woodbury really seem to be buying into this. Now, granted, stay calm, let's not all run off into the zombie-infested wasteland is a reasonable line of thinking to advocate in this situation. But still, I mean, everything she says in that it's just so trite. I mean, God, really. That's really just all I have to say, folks. I'm too exasperated for anything else, I'll be perfectly honest with you. Yeah, just talking about that makes me wish there was something other than water in that. Okay, so let's continue on talking about our characters. Let's talk about Carl briefly. We're seeing him, still in his role as the good soldier, I think is a good way to put it. The only real insight that we get into what's going on with Carl in his head is where he has that little conversation with Carol, and we see that Carl is not handling what happened with his mom quite as well as we might have been, as his first impression of the situation might have been. And well, it certainly does seem interesting enough. It's not really touched upon enough to say anything more than that. Now, let's kind of talk about Tyrese and his group. Now, a lot of folks have been talking about what's going to be going on with Tyrese, and have been suggesting him as a replacement leader for Rick, given that Rick seems to be ready to check into the squirrel farm. Now, I honestly think that this is probably where the show is going to go, and I'm all right with that. We do have that scene where Tyrese takes that moral stand against Ben and his dad. Ben is the son, right? Whatever. Those guys are obviously, fodder, so who cares? But anyway, now he does, he and his sister, they take that stand. It's not, it's not an easy thing to do, of course, to stand against somebody who's a member of your group, who you've been through a lot. But Tyrese and his sister do that, and not because it's simply brutal practicality. These are people who are doing this because it is genuinely the moral thing to do. And people doing things simply because that is what real morality demands is an extraordinarily rare thing in the Walking Dead world at this point. I mean, we've even seen Rick, who is really at heart a good guy, do some pretty cold and brutal stuff. I mean, look at what happened with Tomas. But let me put it this way. One of my favorite writer of all time is the late Hunter S. Thompson. And Thompson once wrote something that really struck home with me, so much so that I memorized it. And he wrote that he who makes a beast of himself frees himself from the guilt of being a man. No, I'm sorry, from the burden of being a man. Yeah. Now, of course, he was sort of talking a lot about basically what we're talking about in that is, and it's even said by Ben's dad, survival of the fittest. Now, of course, Thompson was talking about that sort of thing in completely different context, but this is essentially what Ben's dad is advocating. We do whatever it is that keeps us alive for another day, which is not an unreasonable stance to take in a world of a zombie apocalypse world. But the thing that Tyrese is saying is, sure, we'll do what we have to do to survive, but we will not do so at the expense of what makes us people. Because the minute you go down that road, well, the governor and the people of Woodbury, well, they've shown us what happens when you go down that road. Now, granted, it's not everybody in Woodbury. Most of the people there are probably actually decent enough folks who've simply been misled. But the governor, well, he's what lies at the end of that road. He is what happens when just basically people allow themselves to become animals. Well, let me put it this way: animals, they do what they have to do to survive. That's why they kill. That's why they fight. There is no other reason. But humanity, because we have sentience, we are capable of making moral choices. We are capable of doing things not because they are simply in the interest of our survival. We are capable of doing things because our moral values demand them of us. I mean, that is literally what really separates humans from animals. Now, granted, there's an infinite number of things you could say in this regard. This is one of the great questions of philosophy throughout the ages, and I'm not so going to pretend that I'm so wise as that I have all the answers on that one. But that is the situation that's at play. It is how in this horrible world where survival, even for the one more day, is a luxury, how do we hold on to the good in us? How do we hold on to what makes us better than an animal? And well, we're going to be exploring that theme for well, really the rest of the run of the series, because that is one of the central themes of The Walking Dead. I mean, it has been repeatedly pointed out that in the Walking Dead world, well, yes, the zombies are, of course, always a threat. The stuff that you really need to worry about are the living. But anyway, I also like, speaking of Tyrese, that we do get a little bit more backstory about him. We understand a little bit more of where he comes from. He's apparently a survivor from Jacksonville. We understand how he and his sister survived the initial outbreak and all this other stuff. Not exactly vital information, but it does certainly add to his story. Now, before we get into talking about Rick, I want to speak briefly about Herschel and the rather obvious CGI that's being applied to his now missing leg. Herschel is, as we need to remember, is basically the only one who really, before all this went down, had any idea that Rick was starting to go really bonkers, which I think is no doubt why he was willing to step in there and really kind of not exactly challenge Rick, but do what was necessary in telling Rick that he was making a mistake. Now remember, Herschel is somebody who has previously been a leader of a group, so it makes sense that he would do this. And again, we also need to remember that at his heart, Herschel is an extremely compassionate man and a very good person. Not without his flaws, of course, but he's the sort of person who is going to recognize Tyrese as a kindred spirit, I think, which is why I think Herschel is willing to step up and go to bat for the guy. We also get to see Herschel interacting with Maggie and Glenn. I think you can sort of see that Herschel realizes that Maggie isn't being completely honest with him. And, well, we'll talk about a little bit more about that when we talk about Maggie in just a minute. But that scene with him and Glenn, where he tells Glenn, that he considers him to be like a son. Wow, I mean, that just really shows you how far Herschel has come as a character. I mean, remember, there was a time when he referred to Glenn as nothing more than that Asian boy, even though he'd been around Glenn well long enough to at least be aware of the dude's name. And let's keep in mind, he wasn't exactly too thrilled with the idea of him and Maggie being involved from the start either. So again, Herschel has really come quite a long way in his character development. Now, speaking of Glenn and Maggie, their responses to what happened in Woodbury are really polar opposites, and I think this is really some potentially very damaging stuff for their relationship, but also extremely interesting stuff for us as viewers. Maggie's taking the approach of thinking about what is best for the group. Now, granted, okay, yes, she wasn't raped, but there's no way in shape or form that you can't call what happened cannot call what happened a sexual assault. So she's obviously got some. I mean, that's got to be some pretty mentally brutal stuff going on. But she's putting that aside because the group has to figure out and focus on surviving. Has to figure out what they're going to do and how they're going to deal with this crazy dude in Woodbury who's got a whole army of really nasty dudes who are very likely coming to kill them. Glenn is taking the exact opposite approach. He has tunnel vision. The only thing he can really think about is killing the governor for what the governor did to Maggie. Now, this is perfectly understandable on the part of Glenn, and it's not unreasonable to think that if they were to kill to the governor, that the threat of Woodbury, well, it would maybe not go away, but would certainly be heavily diminished. Crush the head of the serpent and all that. Pardon me. But again, like I said, Glenn has tunnel vision. He is just on a real mission of vengeance here, and anything that seems to get in that way is just going to drive him crazy. I mean, Glenn is basically, 80s action movie guy at this point. Or, what was it? Who was the dude from Death Wish? Charles Bronson? Yeah, I think that was Charles Bronson. So, Glenn, not thinking real clearly at the moment. But I have to say, this is actually really interesting stuff for his character. I mean, think about how Glenn was generally kind of joking around with Rick, even when he first met him. He was much more jovial fella, and now look at poor Glenn now. He's not the same dude. He's, like everybody else, become a harder person in order to survive. And whether or not he's going to be able to hold on to that brighter side of himself, the side of himself that is what drew Maggie to him in the first place, well, that remains to be seen. And now, of course, we come to the pièce de résistance of the characterization this episode. It's watch Rick Grimes go completely crazy. Now, now I know some people from what I've seen people saying about this episode had kind of thought that we dealt with Rick's mental vacation off to La La Land. Well, no. I mean, last episode we saw Rick hallucinating Shane. Now he's hallucinating Lori. Before he was hallucinating people talking on the phone. This hasn't gone away. Rick has managed to push it off to the side a little bit, but well, the dam has broke, and he's off. He's gotten washed away off to Crazy Town. Now, yeah, exactly whether or not this means everybody is going to immediately kind of try and throw Tyrese and his friends out the door. Well, it's not a democracy, as Rick said, and he seems to have made his decision, even though he was screaming at a wall at the time. So I guess we'll see. But as I said, I don't think Tyrese is going to be going, and his friends are going to be going away quite just yet. But I do like how they do sort of subtly hint at all of this before it happens. I mean, look at the way Rick just seemed to go to a weird place when he was holding his daughter, something that you would really think would ground him, but in fact it seems to have almost the exact opposite effect. So yeah, Rick, there's some really weird, crazy stuff going on with Rick, so it'll be interesting to see where his story goes from here. Let me see here. And I'm just looking at my notes here. I actually think that covers everything that I had to say about this episode. Again, there's lots of very nice character moments, but there's also some really weak moments in the storytelling. There's things that don't really make sense, and it's just not a terribly focused episode. Now that we're back up to speed with everybody, I think that from now on we'll be able to really kind of focus on the characters on a more individual level and kind of get into them, and thus tell stories more effectively, is basically where I'm trying to go with this. So again, a reasonably solid episode, but probably not one of the stronger ones this season. Anyway, folks, that's all I got for you this time. As always, please comment, rate, and subscribe, and of course you can follow me on Twitter at Who's Your Jedi. Until next time, take care and have a good one.